Welcome, wandering souls and lost sailors, to the Ship of the Dead podcast.
Welcome aboard the Ship of the Dead. Sailing the dark Caribbean with me today is none other than the Sean McCoy. Sean is part of Tuesday Night Games. He is the designer of Mothership RPG. Mothership's new Bounty Hunter Toolkit, Wages of Sin, is funding now on Backerkit. This month is Mothership Month, a group collab crowdfunding project showcasing some of the brightest stars in the Mothership third-party community. Sean, welcome aboard, you salty dog.
Hey, all right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Sean, I'm such a huge fan of your work. Regular listeners to the show will know that Mothership and your design process is a constant point of reference for me. And it's great to finally get you down, get to pick your brain. Before we get into all the current topics, I wanted to zoom out a bit and talk about your intersection with the OSR. You've made this hugely successful science fiction role-playing game. It's not medieval. There are no dragons. There's no magic typically. It uses a D100 as a core mechanic, yet it's still regarded as one of the best things to come out of the quote OSR. What do you think about that?
The OSR got me back into D&D and role-playing games sort of in general, starting with DCC and Don Stroud introducing that to me. And I really just liked the blogosphere, just people constantly working on stuff, new settings, new classes, and explaining things about Dungeons & Dragons that I'd really struggled with, like how to do a hex crawl or even how to key a dungeon, right? I came into it during 3rd edition, and a lot of this stuff was pretty opaque to me. And so I was sort of a student of those lessons about how to make something usable. What does lethality mean? And a lot of the questions that OSR was asking. I do sort of delineate that there's just a ton of people who just play old school D&D, right? That's not OSR. They're just playing older editions of D&D, and that has a certain play style. And I think that's really cool, right? And there's a real appeal to that. I love original Dungeons & Dragons a lot. BX I like a lot. I even think a lot of 1E is really interesting. But yeah, there's that conversation of is something OSR or not OSR? So it's not OSR in that it's not old school Dungeons & Dragons at all. It's just that when I was coming of age as an RPG designer, that was the circles I was traveling in, right? And so that's sort of where this is born out of and what the lineage is in terms of just the focus on layout and design and the focus on problem solvings, or what they might call pawn stance in story games, where we're really more interested in what you as the player does in this fictional environment, rather than what the character does as a designer, not as if you run Mothership however you want to run it.
Sure.
That's the real intersection for me, is just what I was into when I was working on this.
Yeah, I almost feel your approach and your influence on the quote OSR, it's almost more about information design and theory crafting of how we're going to deal with this game, but then also the presenting of that to the GM. I feel that's one of the things that I've really taken from Mothership. It's okay, yeah, this isn't how to run a quote dungeon, but this is the way to present an adventure, or this is a great way to get this information out of your head as the designer and into ultimately the player's experience, right?
Yeah. So as a graphic designer, that was obviously the stuff that popped out at me during the OSR, was all this stuff about say Stonehell, right? You're just, or Carcosa, you're just going key map. Even the tables is an information design thing. The OSR's obsession with tables is a little bit of an obsession with information design and how it intersects with the game. That's the huge component for me. And what was interesting, and where the OSR and sort of Mothership sort of collide, partly because I am a forever DM, and running published adventures is difficult, and it shouldn't be, because they're the professionals, right? Mm-hmm. And so I really have become passionate about what do we need at the table? And I'm constantly even reading old Adventures of Ours and going, this is way too much of this kind of information and not enough of this kind of information. Could we scaffold that information better to say, what's the big thing you need to get? Or even taking a different writing voice. If you were to tell your friend in an email how to run an adventure, it would be completely different to how you would write it in a published adventure. It would be okay, so basically there's 2 bad guys and there's some treasure, and the treasure's on the 3rd level. The big thing you need to know is that there's a trap that prevents you from getting to the treasure unless you kill one of the bad guys. You would never write that in a published adventure. It's way too casual, and it doesn't sound like an adventure. But I'm trying to move us in that direction where we just go, Like let's take all the sort of bells and whistles off and get down to like, what do you need to know right now to run this game in the most casual conversational way possible, right? And that's a tension, that Luke and I are always trying to find.
I was literally thinking about Luke as you said this, because Luke Gearing, who is your new full-time writer, right, at Tuesday Night Games,
That's
you
right,
guys
yeah.
have like a constant, I guess I'll say Twitter battle about bullet points versus like full prose. And I think it's like, he's always on the like prose side, but he's your guys' on-staff writer. Can you tell us about what it's been like having Luke on board, and B, just that like conflict of pretty long prose versus bullet point information design?
Yeah, so we have sort of like a pro wrestling rivalry online, which I really enjoy. The biggest thing, like beyond like Luke being an amazing writer, right, which I think he is just one of the best in this space, is he's a total professional to work with, right? And that made our working relationship get better and better and better. He came on and did a little bit for A Pound of Flesh. He wrote all of Gradient Descent. Yeah. So I sort of knew that I could send him into the wilderness with a machete and he would come back with dinner, Mm-hmm. And so that put him on our radar of like, this is somebody we want to work with long term, because like meeting deadlines and hitting the goals, like that's 90% of it, right? And then we do have this tension where he wants to write adventures that don't dumb down to you and force you to think and engage and read the prose. And I have the mindset of like, okay, cool, but like I got to make dinner tonight. So meet me halfway. Like I paid the money, I bought the ticket, like let me go on the ride, And I think out of that tension is going to save both of us from our worst impulses, right?
Sure.
Which mine would be to write like an Axios Politico style, smart brevity, bullet pointed, like here's what you need to know, these 3 things that maybe wouldn't inspire you or light you up. And then on his end, it'll shave off some of the edges of like, okay, do we need the genealogies of people's horses and all this sort of like insane extra content, and hopefully find like a middle ground. But I think there's always going to be some sort of creative tension when you're working with collaborators, but finding the right stuff to have tension about, where you're pulling each other sort of towards each other, that's like a good sign in a creative collaboration, rather than like we're trying to pull you away from each other, away from what's good about you. I think Luke and I are pulling each other sort of towards a better version of ourselves.
Yeah, well, and you guys have clearly a developed working relationship now, and he's familiar with the line, so Absolutely. He knows what is going to work and what won't, whether that's his preferred writing format or not, right?
Yeah, and we're trying not to be prescriptive about like what's capital G good, and more like what are we trying to do with Mothership versus which is different than Wolves Upon the Coast or And Monsters or And Treasure and that kind of thing. These products have different audiences and there's different things we're trying to teach, right? And in Mothership, we are really making a play for like, get it to the table as fast as possible, expand the player base, expand the amount of people who are playing, which you don't have to do if you're not trying to build your audience from the ground up like we are. If you're saying like, here's a Dungeons and Dragons adventure, you can really kind of write that however you want, because the audience is there, already for you. We have to create our own for Mothership. Yeah.
And there's like a, almost like a common lingua franca, if you will, for what D&D is, that you guys have had to kind of go back to the drawing board as a new game without an established IP. I mean, can we talk about that? Like, I feel like you have to be somewhat proud that you came up with this idea in your mind. Of course, there is a science fiction horror like zeitgeist, if you will, but it has to be,
Alien's a big inspiration. Yeah,
of course it has to, but it has to feel great to have like turned that into a role playing game experience that is its own brand. Can you tell us a little bit about how that journey has been?
Yeah, obviously there's like the Alien RPG and we have a lot of other, but like the space is also very crowded with a lot of licensed games.
Yes.
Star Wars or Blade Runner or whatever. And no shade to those at all. West End Star Wars is one of my favorite games, but we wanted this to be like a marathon where we would be in this sort of for the long haul. And that meant developing like a game that, like Dungeons and Dragons, touches on a lot of fantasy, but isn't any one thing. We wanted to do that for sci-fi horror. And we sort of ratcheted down one notch from both sci-fi and horror to get sort of a sweet spot of like, there's a big audience here, but not like making Starfinder. It's got to be insanely difficult because sci-fi is everything to everyone. And sooner or later, you need to pick what kind of sci-fi are we talking about here, right? And just adding horror onto that really helped narrow our focus down, even to questions like, what's ship combat going to be like? We had somebody in our Discord saying like, I really wish they had dogfighting rules. And we were kind of like, there isn't really a lot of dogfighting in Mothership. You're in a giant, ship that's run by a computer. And the horror is at the players are making the decision to blow up the other ship, but it's not so much Star Wars where you're in like a jet pilot thing, which we felt was both more realistic but also more terrifying. And so being able to lean back on that sort of high horror sci-fi intersection has allowed us to limit ourselves creatively and make better choices.
Yeah, it's interesting because I kind of feel like what you guys have done with Mothership is a lot what D&D did with Lord of the Rings. Like I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. Like it's like my favorite, but I have tried every version of a Lord of the Rings role-playing game that I can think of. And they just never click with me because I feel like I'm like destroying the Bible or something, like I'm messing with some like thing that's complete. And with Mothership compared to say like Alien, obviously I'm a huge Alien fan. I prefer to play Mothership because there's not one xenomorph. It's literally like whatever I can think of. It's literally like all the bumpers are off,
No, I bring this up about Star Wars a lot. I love Star Wars and I would love to play a Star Wars role-playing game, but I always run into this thing, which is that all the things that I think are cool about Star Wars are completely incompatible with a role-playing game. Like,
yes,
I think Jedi are cool, and I think Stormtroopers are cool, and I think Darth Vader's cool, but you can't play a game where you have like Jedi plural and Stormtroopers, right? Those don't exist at the same part in the timeline. And so like the D&Dification of Star Wars would be like lightsabers, there's a laser sword and there's like an empire and all these sort of things, but it's a lot more open because for the story to work, you kind of want to limit it to this narrative of like a chosen one. But like chosen one narratives, like in Lord of the Rings, are awful for role-playing games. You have to explore the setting in a role-playing game, which means there have to be a lot of things that kind of like a limbo tension point about to explode that's difficult to sort of capture like in a movie,
Yeah. Well, hats off to you because I think Mothership does such a good job. I mean, and you guys do this thing which we always talk about on the show of world building through tables. I know you're mentioning tables, but I feel like there isn't a setting, capital S setting, as you would say in Mothership, but there is a setting in that when you look at these tables, there's not dogfighting, you kind of have this world that's been built up around it via the tables. Can you tell us a little bit about like what that writing process was like? And also like in your mind, is there a larger setting? Like if you're running Mothership, are you in a setting that hasn't really been written yet?
It's tough. And we're constantly talking about it because I don't like, the OSR story games, like every design school has its like bad words, right? And in the OSR, it's often like lore is bad or story is bad. But what they really mean is that like table lore is good. If you've been running a campaign for 20 years and you have long histories of NPCs, most OSR people are like, that's amazing. You want that. They just want it generated from the table. They don't want to have to look it up in a book. Same with narrative. If you have all this narrative about all these factions that your players fought and all this sort of organic stuff grew out, people love that. But they don't like somebody saying like, here's the narrative, here's the story, right? And so in Mothership, what's one thing that's nice about moving away from fantasy is that we get to make a break with all these and start with a clean slate and go like, okay, what do we really think about lore? And so Luke and I have this conversation a lot about like, what does good lore mean? And so part of it like, is bad lore to me in an RPG is like history trivia, right? Like Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot at this time and this date, and that started the war. That's like something you have to memorize, right? Good lore is like very actionable to the PCs, so it's usually like a lot more local, Like good lore in a D&D game is like, it's like a rumor table. That's all good lore, So like setting building through tables, I think is really helpful to give you like 7 to 10 things that you need to know and like you get it, right? This is why we always like your table entries have to pack a big punch. We came back to this a lot with our healing rules. We were like, we've got all these conditions and stress and damage that you could take. We were going back and forth, like, should we have a rule for how long it takes to heal or how many points? And we were like, we could solve this with a list of medical procedures that are expensive and exist in the world. And that's lore, like these specific medical procedures. And that would give you enough of an idea to say like, oh, okay, I can invent like a cryo tube, med bay, med pod thing in my game. And it would cost, 1 million credits or whatever. And so again, that was like marrying the mechanics into the gameplay a little bit and using that sort of as lore. And as we get bigger, we're doing more like short fiction and comics and looking to expand the game into like those kinds of spaces. We're again asking ourselves like, how can we create like a compelling narrative that isn't tied to facts you would look up online? And it comes back to like big themes, like corporations versus unions and capitalism and, loneliness and sort of like this dystopia of technology and this cynicism around technology. Those are things we can keep coming back to over and over and over again. And people go like, okay, yeah, I get it. Right. Games like the X-Files is perfect for this. I don't think anybody really cares. You could make an X-Files RPG like Delta Green very easily because you just sort of throw everything in there and the lore is like contradictory and whatever. It doesn't matter if you know who CGB Spender is or whatnot, which is a lot harder to do in, say, like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings.
Sure. Well, and also I think with the X-Files example, like maybe if you're watching the show and the lore changes over time, they explain it away with like, oh, we misunderstood it. And that really works for a horror game because we thought it was one thing and it's deeper. Like the problem is deeper. That really works well. Yeah.
And there are big themes that you could say, like, we don't trust the government. The truth is out there, right?
Yes.
Like there's a tension between science and faith, what you can prove and not prove. Like that make it very easy for like a third party creator or a warden or whatever to hang their hat on and to get a handle on, because it's not built around like, okay, there are these things called Jedi, right? And there's also a thing called Sith and there's midichlorians. Like you don't need to know all that stuff. You just need to know the big picture. Like, the government's always bad,
Yeah. I mean, this reminds me of one adventure I have is the Tide Break, which I thought was so cool. For people who don't know, this is basically this guy made like an indie video game. It's kind of like Subnautica, but you only ever see a weird like heads up display from inside the submarine, It's cool. Amazing. Yeah. It's an amazing video game. And he made a Mothership module out of it and did all the art. And I'm like, this is perfect. Like his world slots in with any Mothership setting, like no problem. I think that's a really great environment for third party stuff. Do you guys ever consider like in your like grand scheme when Mothership is all done and dusted and you've moved on to something else, decades down the road, are there setting books or will there just be like kind of more like toolkits and modules like we've seen so far?
I think the setting books that we're thinking of right now are genre niches. Like we're working on Null Hack, which is our cyberpunk version of Mothership, which we consider in the same world as Mothership, but on a core world where there's cities and an urban environment and your relationships with people are more important. We call it like if Blade Runner and Alien are in the same cinematic universe, this is the Blade Runner version.
Yeah.
But we've talked about doing that with other sort of micro genres. Like we have like one that we're calling Crashlander. That's more like Mad Max, right? Where it's like the space elevator is broken and you're on this core world, this rim world that's, semi-post-apocalyptic, but that will allow us to do things like Westerns and crafting and, desert sort of stuff. And so we haven't seen like a setting book that we would feel like we would need to jump to do, but our version of that would be like genre books or niche genre books that sort of expand the gameplay into specific styles,
Then I have to assume it'll be the same kind of, table design and like broad strokes rather than read these 2-column pages for 300 pages and then you understand the backstory, right?
Yes. And the next book we're working on after Wages of Sin, which is just like a codename Snows right now, is a big hex crawl set inside an O'Neill cylinder that's been abandoned by aliens. If you don't know O'Neill cylinders, it's just a cylinder and the terrain is on the inside. So as it spins, it has the centripetal force to create gravity. Right?
Kind of like a bunch of halos stuck together, right?
Yes, exactly. Right. So you have this long one, basically just a tube in space. So we discover one. It's been long abandoned by the alien civilization that lived there. It's covered in snow. And so it's sort of like a Mountains of Madness, Shackleton, Arctic adventure, mixed with like Rendezvous with Rama. And so we're going to get deep into hex crawls and what's going on with this alien civilization and that kind of thing, which does necessitate a lot of lore. You need to know what's going on as a warden. And so that's going to be our big challenge is like, how do we create grand mysteries and unveiling information as you're building your base and doing a survival hex crawl. And so it'll be like our take on hex crawling also. And so we're going to be digging into those ideas too about like, how do you reveal important background information without having, even like Arden Vol, right? Like Super OSR Mega Dungeon has like next level, like, all right, just 6 or 7 pages of backstory for this level. I'm not saying it's bad. That's not a knock on that, but we are trying to limit that. Like, how quickly can we get across this information without making you feel like you're reading a history book?
Yeah, I mean, you want adults to be able to play it. Adults with time limits on their schedule to be able to digest it. Yeah, of course.
Right.
Of course. I want to pivot a little bit to influences. You had this really cool bingo card in the Mothership Kickstarter that had, the 25 or 24 core influences for Mothership, which I love. I stole that for the Pirate Board Kickstarter, of course.
Yeah.
But one thing I love about this is that not only do I see am I going to like this, but I also get a list of things I'm going to like that I didn't know. Because, you're getting this influence list. I'm wondering if you made this again today, is there anything new you would add or tweak? And if it was longer, are there things that you deep influences to Mothership that aren't on the bingo card? I don't know how well you remember it or not.
So we put together a little pamphlet that was kind of like an appendix N that we have never released.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
That goes a little bit deeper. It's a little bit longer. We called it the 2022 collector's catalog, but we're always trying to scrape what are the short stories and all that stuff, because I think sometimes where this can be dangerous is is this just a list of cool things that you think are cool, which is nothing wrong with that, but it's definitely a marketing tool. We want somebody to know oh, if you like Super Metroid, you'll like this. But it can also be a thing where it's oh, it's Berserk and Dark Souls, and you just sort of go well, that's what everybody wants to be like, right? So a good version of these lists not only includes people, but it precludes some people, right? Where you go oh, I didn't like that, so I wouldn't like this. You want it to be very specific, right? Some of the stuff that was on there, I think Diamond Dogs, which is a short story by Alistair Reynolds, was on there. And it's this team of people exploring an alien megastructure, and every level there's more and more complex mathematical problems and linguistic problems, and whenever they're wrong, the structure chops off a limb and then heals them a little bit, and so they're I don't know if it heals them or they heal themselves, but basically they get more and more cybernetic as they traverse this tower trying to figure it out. And I was that's very, very, very Mothership, right?
Yeah.
So let me see some stuff that's on here. Did you ever see Leviathan in 1989?
No.
Okay, so this one's great. It got really panned as just an Alien ripoff. Yeah. Right? It's by George P. Cosmatos, who did Rambo, First Blood Part 2, and Cobra.
Okay.
And he did Tombstone, right?
Yeah, okay.
But it's starring Peter Weller, and it's basically an underwater sci-fi horror, The Abyss or Deep Star 6. But people panned it as just an Alien ripoff at the time. But there were so many movies coming out back then, that if you go back and you go this is amazing, I would want a bajillion more of these, right? Yeah. It's an Alien ripoff, in a good way. There were just a lot of these kinds of movies going on, sort of at the time, right? I think I might include Crimes of the Future, the Cronenberg one, even though it doesn't seem very Mothershipy in the retro futurist way, the surgical stuff and the just weird subculture that's grown out of it. I've really gotten into. People love Prospect, which I still haven't seen.
Oh, you haven't seen it? I can't believe that.
No, I know. Isn't that crazy?
I actually have it listed here because obviously Alien and Event Horizon in 2001, we all know that's what this game is about. But if Prospect is it literally plays out like a Mothership module. It's
isn't that crazy?
The gear that they're wearing, it looks like Dead Planet. It's amazing. You have to watch it. It's so Mothership.
No, I've heard so many good things about it, and I
love that you haven't seen it. That's so exciting for me.
It came out when we were working on it,
and
so it was just people were you got to check it out, and I was okay.
I feel another one I might maybe include, especially with all the wet Mothership, is Underwater is very
yes.
A little more on the spoilers, but it gets a little more cosmic horror at the end, which works great for Mothership.
I think we're also looking into more nonfiction now is a thing where we start looking more into nonfiction. We almost included IBM and the Holocaust as one of our appendix N books, because it's just about a giant corporation that's very well regarded today that had a key role, in an awful thing. And that being part of what Mothership is and that you can get a lot. Luke's a big fan of the Politics of Heroin book, which is about the CIA and the heroin trade. Yeah. Wow. And it's a big textbook, and we haven't found the right place to put that. But again, it does feel appendix N-y. And for another game, we're working on Spiral, which is our paranormal investigation game. We've talked a lot about Aberration in the Heartland of the Real, which is a huge deep dive into Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. Again, another Luke book, but it goes through like, I think people, our generation maybe don't think about it that often because 9/11 and Columbine and all these sort of things like happened after it.
Yeah.
But like the Oklahoma City bombing was this huge nexus of conspiracy theories and the FBI falsifying it. Like, it's just a very wild event, similar to like the JFK assassination. Right?
Sure,
and this book goes through all of it. But again, it would be a great appendix N for a paranormal investigation game.
Yeah, is this catalog going to see the light of day?
The one that I'm talking about?
Your Appendix N catalog thing.
I think we'll release it as a pamphlet. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
We just sort of slowed down on the pamphlets during the box set. One, because like it's a huge uphill battle financially, right? Like you just can't make a ton of money on them.
Well, and they're really hard to go to retail. Like,
yes,
we moved away from them just because. Hey, do you want to buy six zines? Like, and then I go find the store and they're like sitting in a, smash between 3 other books. Like, it's just tough. Yeah. I like them personally, but
I like them too. I think they're better for like convention giveaways or like mailers or whatever, even just stuff that you throw in like a box as like a promo. Sure. And so we sort of retooled that, but I think we'll find a way. We were ramping up to do like a monthly subscription where it's like you get a patch and a pamphlet and, run it at your local game store.
Yeah, sure.
And we've tapped the brakes to be like, let's get hardcovers going. But yeah, I think we would release that for sure.
Nice. Before we move on from influences, I did want to take this opportunity to ask you, what are some of your key like information design and graphic design influences, especially like non-RPG ones? Because I feel like it's clear you've done your homework. You have a self-education in the visual language. Like, what are some of your influences for that?
So I've been doing graphic design since like high school. I was doing like theater play posters, basically is where I got my start. And then over time, I've gotten more and more like into grid systems, which you could see. There's like a very famous
for our listeners. This is like where you have a grid on an invisible grid in the background that you're using to help lay out the thing.
Align everything. There's a lot of stuff I like in sort of the mid-century modern, like 1950s era, like old Boy Scout manuals, which you can pick up very cheaply at half price books or whatever. But they have this like blend of like diagram and illustration, and it's like 3-color printing because they're super cheap. That looks awesome, and I don't think is replicated enough. You might see something close to it in like Neverland and those sort of books. Have a sort of similar style.
We just had Andrew on for the second time last week because his new book is out. Yeah, his Wonderland book is out now.
Yeah,
it's so good. Yeah.
I have this giant book that is by I think it's Vaughn Oliver. He did all these like Pixies and Cocteau Twins album covers. And so I have a big art book of his sort of stuff. So as I get older, it's like we want to get into weirder acid graphics and Y2K and some of the stuff that's actually very hard to replicate authentically digitally, right? Because it was created at a time like a lot of like cutting edge graphic designers in like the heyday of the magazine era are doing stuff like photographing collages. Chip Kidd is doing stuff like that. Not that you can't make a collage in Photoshop or anything these days, but like looking into stuff like gradient descent was a very difficult process where like we built a map. I like things looking like they're printed on paper, right? So we'd build a map in Illustrator, which is a vector-based program, right? And then we'd import that into Photoshop and then apply effects to it to make it look like the ink is bleeding. And then we'd put that on a paper texture and then apply a gradient to that. And so it had all these layers of just sinking into a wet page, so it looked like an older document, which is like the classic, like, what do they call it in fantasy? The parchment background. It's like our take on the parchment background that everybody makes fun of. But like, I like things that look like they're printed materials rather than like a sci-fi HUD on a piece of paper, right? There's like a cognitive dissonance to me that like, well, that wouldn't be what this looks like. I want it to look like what a manual from this time period would look like. I want it to look like what the printed thing would look like if I was there, It
kind of reminds me of the Dharma Initiative stuff from Lost.
Yeah.
Or like, did you see the Loki TV show? Like all the tech they have for the like multi-dimensional, it's like a government corporation that controls the,
I forget what they're called. Yeah.
But like that design aesthetic, it's like far future from the 70s and 80s, you know, it's like,
there's a retrofuturism, heavy bureaucracy, heavy manuals. Because that NASA manual was very like informative for a lot of people. And there were just all these like standard and guide manuals that you get printed. I have tons of like logo books from the 50s and 60s.
Where do you find those?
You end up eBaying them, you know. I'll send you some links if you want to some of this. Yeah,
sure. Yeah, we'll put some in the comments. Like, so you find out about them and then you hunt them down. It's not like you discovered them. Okay, I got you.
Yeah, no, I wasn't in like an office or like in a bookstore or whatever. Saul Bass, the creative, like the Southwestern Bell AT&T logo, did like the Vertigo titles. There were just a lot of really great designers at this time.
Sure.
And then you end up getting into industrial design, like product design, you know, like Olivetti typewriters and all this sort of stuff. And it just sort of pushes and pulls you in a lot of different directions. And then we just hired a creative director, Adam McIver, who's I'm the biggest fanboy of as a graphic designer. He's a really good illustrator too. And so then you like meet graphic designers and they start passing you stuff and going like, oh, you should check this out if you like that, you know?
Yeah, it's like you guys are building your own little culture.
Yeah, you have your own little library catalog, right?
Yeah. But I mean, your own culture as a team as well, though. Like you're developing your own design language amongst each other.
Yes.
How has that been? Like, have you enjoyed the process of being more of a manager and less of a do-it-all-yourself guy?
My background's in film, and I always wanted to be like a writer-director, right? So, and I was a theater kid. So collaborative team building is like what I enjoy to do. I like want to be the guy that like builds the A-team. And so like I didn't have any illusions going into this about being like I wanted to be able to solo do everything because it meant that no matter where I was in my life, I could continue doing this job, right? Which is difficult with like film, even though it's getting a lot easier. You were like say like in music, right? If you can write music and sing or whatever, then and you could record, you're pretty free to go. And that doesn't mean you wouldn't collaborate with an amazing bassist or producer or whatever.
Sure.
But you're not held back by that. And so with Mothership and game design in general, as I was sort of coming into my own as a creative person, I was learning like, okay, I can do all of this stuff. But also as I get older, my skill set is in the business side. I've put more and more time into like, what is it like growing the business and doing the financials and the advertising, the marketing. And there are other people who are much better at me at the individual pieces, right? We work with better illustrators and better graphic designers and better writers. And a big book that I read, it's a short book, but an informative book from me, was called The E-Myth Revisited. So if you're looking to get into publishing.
Talk about it all the time, yeah. We were talking about it today in my company meeting because we're like, oh, let's E-Myth this, make somebody else do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't want to get into that habit of like, I forget what they call it, like not a Mary Sue, but they have a term for somebody where you're like, well, just give it to them and they'll handle it. And all of a sudden this person starts handling more and more and more stuff at your company that you find distasteful and you don't know how to do. And all of a sudden they leave because you can't possibly pay them enough and they know how to run your whole company. So I've wanted to like master a thing as best of my ability and then hire somebody who could do it better than me, but I now know enough to be able to manage them and know whether they're meeting their benchmarks or whatever.
That book has a lot of really cool things about, he has this whole analogy where he talks about like the hotel business, you know, and he talks about hiring, like don't go hire the best manager you can find. Hire someone better than that without the experience that can grow from your experience of how to do it the correct way for your brand and company. And I feel like that is a very good, like that totally makes sense for you guys. Cause it's like, well, this guy might be really good at this one thing, but when you bring him into the fold of Tuesday Night Games and Mothership, then all of a sudden they can blossom into this whole new thing. Yeah.
It's like you can't like pick out a spouse on paper, right? Like all this stuff is relational and we're sort of slow to hire and people have to be like a good fit because like these things like professionalism or meeting deadlines are super important. And that's been one of the things that I've been super interested watching with Pirate Borg is like, I like the people you're hiring and I've worked with some of them. And I've been like, oh, if Pirate Borg's hiring them, that's like a really good sign for the health of that company.
Yeah, sure.
And you're working in this niche of like you're coming out of Morkborg, and I don't know what your plans are to sort of transition into like not being dependent on that other system long term, right? And establishing yourself as like the pirate fantasy game, right?
Oh yeah.
Or like pirate horror, you know?
I was actually walking my dog today and thinking like, yeah, like I like to think of us as like if you guys are the science fiction horror niche, Like, we're the Grimdark Pirates. Like, we're the like, you can only come to us for that, you know, be the only game in town. Yes. That's the idea. Yeah. We're working on the team building. It's important. And there's no question. You're talking about Zach Goins. Give a shout out to Zach, because he is an amazing addition to our team. Cool thing about Zach is it's kind of like what you're talking about with the slow to hire thing. Like, I don't want to bloat the team, but we knew Zach from the convention circuit. You know, and he was always the guy who like he understood everything on a business side, but more so on like just like a vibe
logistics.
side. Logistics too. Yeah. So when the opportunity, we weren't even hiring when the opportunity came around, I was like, Zach is on our team now.
That's how it worked with Adam McIver. Al and I had worked with him on the World Championship Rush Roulette like a decade ago. And we were like, he's amazing. We should hire him for all of our games. He works with both of us really well. He takes feedback really well. He's a really great, he's a game designer too, so he gets it. And then he got hired full-time by Tasty Minstrel Games. And we were like, oh, okay. And then he got hired full-time by Panda. And we were like, well, there's no way we're ever going to be big enough to hire him. And then we were talking, we're like, you know, we really could use like a full-time graphic designer that would like, because I'm the graphic designer right now and I'm a very competent designer, but I need to be focusing on these other things that are going to grow the company, you know?
Let's talk about Wages of Sin. This is I guess it's the first like official expansion for Mothership 1E. Is that, you know, I mean, at least it's the first hardcover you guys have done. Give us the elevator pitch.
So Wages of Sin is a bounty hunting toolkit with D100 fleshed out bounties. Each of them is a one shot or more. Internally, we had this big discussion after 1E, like where do we go next? We know we're going to hardcovers next. That's where we need to be for the market. But we have like 4 or 5 products that are huge products, like 1 or 2 hardcover books as the initial offering, maybe with a starter set, maybe with a map pack, you know, like campaign stuff. That's where we want to get into. But we just had like a historically delayed massive Kickstarter. Can we do that over again? Or do we need to sort of win back some credibility by just like knocking a book out of the park, right? And so we had this Wages of Sin bounty hunter idea where it was like, what about like just 100 scenarios, 100 one-shots that can tie together or not tie together? Some of them are horror, some of them are not. And then we looked around at like bounty hunting sci-fi games, and they're like not really killing it here. Where you just like have a book of just like, here's all the bounties, like go nuts, put them on your map and go crazy. And so we were like, okay, cool. We could like stake a claim here, have a book that's like multi-system friendly, where it's like all of these have information about their stats, but their stats are like a footnote, literally like a footnote at the bottom. And the rest is just like in-world information, things like bounty levels, rewards, whether they're wanted dead or alive, where you need to pick them up, where you need to return them, which is pretty system neutral, right? And so we thought that like, one, we could support, we lay out like these 10 campaign frames in the Warden's Guide. And we're always kind of looking at that list when we develop products like, hey, would this hit any of our campaign frames? Because it's like a horror game and a high lethality one, you're always sort of going like, can this do campaigns? Can this do campaigns if people die? And we're trying to change people's minds about what campaigns mean, because it's so tied to D&D. And D&D campaign, it's like, I have a character who goes from level 1 to level 20, and they get super powerful, and if they die, it's like awful. And the OSR sort of combats that a little bit. But like, the history of campaigning in games is like huge, and war games and all these other things. But there are a lot of games, even like Boot Hill or Gunslinger or whatever, where it's like the idea is you're like playing a session and then you play again and again and again, like BattleTech, right? Or Warhammer. Again, I'm going back to war games, but we're trying to expand RPGs into like a campaign can be anything if choices matter from week to week, right? Like Alien is surrounded around the Xenomorph and Wayland Yutani, and there's one character that survives for a few sessions, and that's Ripley. But for the most part, everybody, like the persistent part of that campaign is the corporation and the alien, right? And so we're trying to change people's mind that like the persistent element of campaign doesn't have to be the player characters. It can be something else. Like you could be playing in a giant war is a great example, but even as grunts who die. But if like you're playing in a campaign about World War II, it's obvious that like even if a mission fails here, the campaign is not over. That mission failed, and there's broader stakes. So we're looking into that sort of thing. And so we wanted, again, something like a bounty hunter toolkit where you could, again, support campaign play by going, you can go to all these things. They can be done between your other missions, and be a book that you would like keep on the table with your other books and go like, any of these are NPCs. They could be clients. They could just be bad guys that you run into and they happen to have a bounty on their head.
I mean, I'm
And then
getting
we were
like all kinds of Mandalorian like things going off where like you get a character who's a bounty who becomes part of the crew instead of turning him in.
Yes.
He's, you know, like that could be your whole campaign right there.
Luke and I started with a big spreadsheet, and we were like, what percentage of these do we want to be straight up villains that like need to be ganked? And how many of these do we want to be innocents who are maligned? And how many of these do we want to be situations that are not what you were told, where you're like, go pick up this person who's been dodging child support, and you get there and the whole station is shut down and there's a xenomorph on the loose, right? So that way, like, it would keep players on their toes. Or, you know, you get down there and there's a whole war or a strike going on and you're there for a bounty, but you're caught up in the events that are going on around. Because we were also weary of like, well, then it just becomes cops and robbers. This is just like 100 bad dudes to kill.
Yeah.
And like, we're not like the play cops game, you know, that's not what we're interested in here. We're interested in like player choice, to be like, does this person deserve, you know, the wages of sin, right?
Yeah. Are there also bounty hunters in this kit?
Yes. So there's 10 bounty hunters that we treat as monster manual entries, basically as unconfirmed contact reports, where they're very dangerous, very awful. There's snippets, like we literally do them exactly like unconfirmed contact report entries, but with a little bit more mechanical detail about like what they can do and what their abilities are. Because we wanted you to be able to hire them, but more than that, this is really like the crime and punishment toolkit, because players are always doing illegal shit in campaigns, and they're always like blowing up spaceships and being like, okay, who cares? And it's like Frasier, like at the end, everything resets back to normal. And we think consequences are interesting. So we're like excited to hit the stretch goal about the prison. Luke's done like this really expansive prison. We wanted to say, it doesn't matter where your players can go, the campaign can keep going. And I think a lot of times in D&D and some of these RPGs, you sort of take everything to like a total party kill, because you don't know what it would be like if the players surrendered to the Goblin King. But that would be really interesting, because they could either try to break out of the prison, or they could get sent on a mission for the Goblin King. Like, just being able to keep the campaign going and not make everything a life or death battle, it's going to lead you to more interesting stories and more interesting gameplay, right? And so we wanted to provide a lot of opportunity to be like, hey, you can go to court. You can get sent to prison. You could face a court martial. You could have bounty hunters after you. That's all going to make the game move to interesting places and take you out of just like, what monster are we fighting this week? You know?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're describing the Dark Caribbean to me, because like getting captured by the Spanish, you know, and you're in a Spanish fort, all of a sudden, man, you got a whole new side mission. Getting out of the fort, you get a bunch of guys on your team, and it's the same way with Mothership. You could totally end up in some space prison and, you know, convince. Or being
like, we're tired of you like attacking. Can you be a privateer, but for us now? Like, can we pay you to like be on our side? Like, there's all this sort of like stuff you can go. If your players don't treat everything like we gotta do a shootout, otherwise the game's gonna end. You know?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm very, very excited for the book. Included in the campaign, you guys are doing a new printed magazine called Mega Damage. It's basically like an oversized. I like your pitch. White Dwarf meets Heavy Metal magazine. Tell us about this thing.
Yeah, so there's like marketing reasons and financial reasons. Like, one of them is like there's only so many games you can play in a year, right? There's an upper limit to how many first party modules we can release. D&D 5e is only releasing like 3 or 4 a year. So they have some idea of how many they can put out. That doesn't mean the third party scene can't put out a lot, because their mission is different. It's to hit different niches or things that we're not going to hit, right? That might not be as broad, but are going to be more specific to your table. And that's like the benefit of them, right? And so one, we want to like be able to sell our customers more products, right? But also we want to make them better wardens. And so one of the ways we could do that is introducing them to more writing and more articles about different topics that aren't game related, but will expand. Like, we have a huge article about the history of the Teamsters in this magazine. We have like fiction recommendations. We have short fiction. We've got comics. And all of those are things that will sort of feed into your brain and inspire you in our own little like Appendix N, without always being like, you know, here's a D10 list of new bounty hunters for your game, right? We want to have a little bit of gaming content, but really we want to just get you stuff that's going to get you fired up. And it's like something you would read or display or whatever, like when you're on break, that you would enjoy reading, and not just mining for like, oh, what's the new ruling on, you know, how warp cores work and jump travel or whatever.
Is Mary Mushman's Knock an influence for this at all?
It's sort of the anti-Knock, and Knock's not like a bad publication. I'm in Knock, but Knock is like all blog posts, right? And articles about gaming that you're supposed to directly rip and use in your table tonight, right?
Mhm.
This is more like a literary magazine or whatever.
Okay,
Where it's
okay,
like
great.
you're going to read this stuff, and then maybe your imagination will start spinning. You go, how can I fit that into my game? Or now I know a little bit more of the history about the Teamsters, or Fiona Geist is writing a big thing about like the history of mega structures and sci-fi, and that gets your wheel spinning. Whereas like I think Nock's strength is like you can use this table at your game tonight, right?
Yeah, okay, gotcha.
It's immediately useful. But also like we do have an eye for like Mothership long form comics and novels and television and film and video games, right? And so this is testing the ground. Like, is our audience into that? Can we deliver on that sort of stuff without sort of ripping the game apart, and still put out like high quality game books?
You said something just there that made me wonder, for you in your mind, like in Sean McCoy's mind, like is Mothership the thing you always wanted to exist and it has popped off? Or is it more like, how they say gas fills the available space? Is it more like that?
Right,
it's
right.
like, this is the thing that's really, really going well. And because of that, you've now dove head first.
No, it wasn't like when I first came up with Mothership, I really wanted to do something in the OSR. I wanted to contribute like in some way.
And wasn't Nullhack like a precursor to it?
Nullhack was like, I really wanted to do a cyberpunk Blade Runner type of thing. And I couldn't wrap my head around it. I was trying to build like a completely unique RPG system from scratch, and I was trying to do too many things at once. And I really didn't know where I was going. And then it wasn't until I was like, what would I do if I was going to make an OSR game? And I was thinking of this idea of exploring a Mothership like a mega dungeon, and that's when I was like, why hasn't anybody done this? And I really love the sci-fi horror world, right? And I'd read and watched a lot of stuff that had really inspired me. And the more I sort of dug into it, I also sort of fell in love with it, where I was going like, I read Stay Frosty, which almost put me off of like making it at all, because I thought Stay Frosty was so good.
That's like a very Aliens Doom OSR game, right?
Yes, absolutely. By KCG. It's wonderful. It's got a deluxe edition on Backerkit right now, put out by the Troika crew.
Melsonian Arts Council.
Melsonian. Yeah. And it looks beautiful. And it's an amazing game. And I'll always sing its praises. So it wasn't just a pure, like, let's look back and see what the financial opportunities are. And this would happen to pop off. I was like obsessed with this, right? And it was a thing. Even now I've had some decompression, but it was a thing where it was like before bed to go to sleep, I would think about Mothership and like what were things we could do and where are places we could go. And even when I have ideas for RPG stuff, they always come back to Mothership, even more than fantasy, right? The fact that it has popped off has been extremely fortunate because we love this world, or this like space, and the problems I'm solving, I'm interested in solving. So with Mothership, the problems we're dealing with and the like stuff we're trying to solve for, like spaceships, right? Spaceship combat. That's stuff that's like very, very interesting to me as like game design problems. And I've always been more of like a Star Wars than Lord of the Rings kid, right? Like I have a deep love of fantasy, but sci-fi is like where I want to be. And that's where like the ideas from modules keep coming, right? Like if I had an amazing dungeon adventure, like we'd be working on it, right? But the sci-fi adventures keep sort of coming to us.
I want to talk about, of course, Mothership Month. We maybe should have started with this since that's what we're diving in the middle of. Tell us about this wonderful thing you put together. I believe it's up to 21 projects. What's the elevator pitch for Mothership Month?
Okay, so Mothership Month is me and 20 other creators, all crowdfunding a bunch of Mothership books at the same time, right? So the sort of pitch internally was to create a event where like we would draw a lot of our customers together at the same time and boost a lot of third-party creators who wouldn't get any attention because of that, sort of like Zine Quest, right? But then also we would bring in like streamers and actual play people, and they would interview the creators and they would do streams. And because everybody would be there, they'd pick up more followers, right? And that would encourage them to make more sort of Mothership content. So we thought of it as almost like a virtual con, which is the way we're going in the future next year. But we thought it would be this just like upwardly mobile, sort of upward spiral sort of situation. And that's what it's proven to be for us. And we had this sort of idea, and then Backerkit was like, we're working on these features. Like, tell us more about that, because we're really close to launching something like that, which was really great.
The Backerkit integration, for those who haven't seen it yet, it's like the coolest thing. Like, I feel like you'd never see this on Kickstarter. Like the fact that like it's its own like banner, but also then it's like its own UI where you can like explore all the projects, and the project is like reporting funding goals as a whole thing. And it's reporting individual, like most popular projects. It's really, really cool, like user interface.
Oh, they worked super closely with us. We have like weekly meetings with them to like get everybody organized and like
very cool.
Put in feature requests or report bugs. And like, so that's one of the amazing things about Backerkit is like we have all this connectivity with their team. And yeah, like as an event, we've got unlockable rewards for backing multiple projects. Next year, I think a big focus of ours is going to be how do we solve the logistics to where we can reduce the number of times you're paying for shipping, which is a big challenge to a lot of our backers. But this is kind of a proof of concept. Like, will this even work? Because we can always do things like combine shipping or have people ship out in waves or whatever. But if nobody was going to show up for this, we wouldn't even go down that route,
Sure.
But it's been great. We have a lot of creators who didn't know if they were going to fund. This is their first time ever. And we didn't want to be cocky, but we were like, we think it's going to be okay. And they're like, well, it's so untested. Nobody knows. And I was like, I agree with you. There's risk here. But everybody funded in 10 hours,
Awesome.
We're moving on to, I haven't even looked today, but we are moving on to.
You're about to break 700K today.
We're about to break 700K, 16,000 backers, which is like how many more backers than we had on Mothership 1E, right? So our audience is growing, and even wages, just like our sort of headliner, if you want to call it, we're at 321,000, 4,000 backers. Like it's huge. And so this is a thing that we're going to try to repeat.
Do you think that your extremely vibrant third-party community, and I don't just mean by quantity, like Morkborg has a very, very vibrant third-party community, but they have a lot more solo creators, first-time creators. There are Mothership projects that are extremely professional. Do you think this vibrant community is it like like we're having a chicken and the egg conversation? How much of that is your fault? Like how much of that is it because you nurtured it, or is it like you guys started nurturing it because it was happening on its own?
Like what we said with Mothership 1E was like we were lucky, but we were prepared to be lucky. And so from the beginning, there was an intent like we have to build a third party scene. And I looked at Judges Guild basically as my example, right? That like there is no D&D without Judges Guild, DCC, Critical Role, right? And those are the things that outlive the creators of the game is this third party scene, right? And so up front, it was just like, how can we get a good license, right? Goodman Games had the best open license. We like looked at theirs and took models from that. But then as we started getting involved, we started making ourselves available to the third party publishers. And I think this is maybe the key difference between us and people who have tried similar things is I think a lot of people want it to be very open, which is that like, oh, do your own thing. We would love for you to do it, which is great. I think that's awesome. And it's very, very exciting. But we've tried to make it a much more of a two-way street where we are like mentoring specific people. We are like sharing our numbers and our financials and our vendors with these people. And then like, as time goes on, we're going to like the next Mothership Month, we want to do like workshops ahead of time that our third party community can get into where we say like, this is how we do this sort of stuff. So we're taking an active interest, not just in like, like, oh, great, you're making free stuff for us. That's awesome. But in like, no, we would like to build you up, right? Ian Newsom and I worked really closely together on Hull Breach, not to take that away from him, but like I shared any information he wanted or sanity checked him through any problems he was having. And he was able to return that to me later because he was dealing with VAT issues like 3 months before we were dealing with VAT issues, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say like, if that's something you're interested in, if you're into mentoring or if you're into like giving people advice, that's how like people like Travis Worthington and Matt Kelly from Exalted Funeral, these people have like invested a lot of time and effort into like giving us advice, sharing numbers, sitting with me on the phone going like, this is my spreadsheet. Does any of this sound crazy? And I've always had that experience at Tabletop, which has been amazing, right? Zach Goins, right? Like there have been a lot of people who have just sort of worked with us very openly. And so we try to pay that back into the third-party community. And then there are people who are like, hey, I paid a down payment on my house because of the Mothership book that I kickstarted. Hey, I was able to like move out. Hey, I'm like, this is my full-time job now.
Yeah.
And when we hear that, we go, well, if you could do that as a third-party creator, right? Yeah. Like that's a huge incentive to keep doing that. We should keep investing in you.
Yeah.
And so we look for people who like ask for advice or take our advice or do well. And we continue to pour resources into them.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very cool. You make me sad I have yet to create a Mothership module. I've just been too sucked up in my own thing, but maybe
your
someday.
thing is great. I see your thing. Like I had a friend in LA and he was like, oh, me and my partner went to this game store and look, you're on a prominent shelf. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And then I like zoomed in. I'm like, what else is there?
Yeah, sure.
And like Pirate Borg is on an end cap and like all these other things that I'm going like, some of these stores are really with it. And you have something that's resonating, right? They're like, there are games like 7 Seas, right, that are out there, but nobody's really nailed it like you guys have. So you have something for sure. I think focusing on that is smart.
Sure.
I wanted to write a Troika book and, all these other things for just because it's fun, but
yeah, it's just weird how life is, like there's a time where, doing an official map for a D&D module would have been like a dream come true. And now I'm like, I don't think they could afford me. It's like one of those really, really weird things, So
I would have loved to have like worked on D&D, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, well, why?
Yeah, now why would you? Yeah. I mean, I know why you would, but for you're in a unique situation where you don't have the time for that, I have a few more minor topics before our little final closing thing. I want to give a shout out to your blog. It really now you've moved more into the Substack, but you've got the Failure Tolerated blog, and now is it the same name for Failure Tolerated?
I call it In Conditions, but I might revert it back. But yeah, I'm just trying to find a way to get people to read the blog posts, and emailing them directly is the best way.
I have found the Substack both of them to be extremely helpful because you have that kind of thing. I don't want to say Steve Jobs, but that thing where you're able to explain technical topics to people who may not understand them and present them in a way. I found the blog very helpful, both as a publisher, but also just as a GM. Like I think the Warden's Manual, Operations Manual is a really good example of that. You're able to like dissect the problem and then present real world solutions. So please keep it up.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's like the way I have to learn. Like I struggle to be a good GM. And so I really want to know what the secret is because I'm not going to stay up. I don't have a lot of time. I'm not going to just stay up and be writing tons and tons of world building stuff. And I can't remember. I have friends who like have these great memories for history and NPCs and names and what's going on. And I just don't have that. Right. And so I've really had to dissect and figure out like what works and why. And then a lot of these, like the publishing deep dives, which I really enjoy writing, are again, like me having to do the research and taking the notes. And at that point you have the notes and it's like, well, I might as well just write an intro and a conclusion. And we've got a blog post here.
Yeah, sure.
And so it comes out of like, not being a teacher from a place of expertise, but being a teacher as like a kid sharing the test notes right after class, right? And being like, this is what it was. Here you guys go.
Were you a good student?
No, I don't know if that was like undiagnosed ADHD or something, but I was a good test taker. I didn't have any like stress in test rooms, right? And a bad homework doer, bad like assigned reading person. So I don't know if I just needed something different. It took me a long time to realize like, oh, when you're out of school, you have to work. And that's way worse than like being in a classroom and like learning. But I think where I've taken to that is that like applied learning, project-based learning, which like wasn't as widespread when I was a kid as it is now, really made sense to me. Like I did very well at my like, in my economics class in senior year, we did like a stock project where you like bought stocks and tracked them. I did really well on that because it like made a lot of sense to me. I could work on it and see how I was doing. But I was always like a project-based guy. I ended up not going to college and made a feature film instead because I wanted to do the thing, right? Mm-hmm. Now I have friends that did go to college and did get into film and do that professionally now. And so it's not knocking that, just for my brain, I need a kind of like learn as you do kind of approach.
Sure. Well, I think we've all benefited from you learning as you do, so keep it up.
Well, thanks,
I want to ask real quick about the Panic Engine dev kit. Is that still in the works? So I believe this is a kind of almost like a SRD for using the Mothership engine in another game that a publisher might create. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's really close. So basically, like, what it is not is it's not like a generic system like GURPS that you can just like reskin and make another game out of. We've done an SRD that was based on Mothership, but we really tried to make this thing called the Panic Engine its own thing. And we're putting together a toolkit now. We call it like a dev kit, which would be a box set very similar to the Mothership core set with components and a notebook you can write in. And the idea here is to give you a launching pad for your game. So you could make something like Cloud Empress, right? And we're hoping to run another group collab with a smaller scope in Q1 of next year, maybe February or March or something, where we would invite a handful of creators to make a Panic Engine game and crowdfund it at the same time while we release this dev kit for other people. And so the idea would just be to like get you making games. It's going to come with some components and a pen or whatever, and a system that is incomplete, and then advice on what you might do to complete it. Because like I love Apocalypse World, right?
Yeah.
And I like that it's very easy to reskin, but I think how easy it is to reskin almost like works against it, because you end up with a lot of palette swaps that haven't really thought about the mechanical implications or what the game should be, right?
Yeah.
They've just like changed a lot of text, which is great. Like go out there and make your game. So, you start where you start. I'm not knocking that, but we wanted to go into something that was like, these are components and you should build something. And if it turns out looking nothing like the Panic Engine, that's great. We don't care about compatibility. We just care about getting you started, right?
Yeah, very cool. Well, excited to see that. I have to ask, Dungeon 23. What an exciting, like I think back to the beginning of last year. For those not familiar, this is an idea you came up with, or at least that you blogged about, where you get a journal. I've got mine right here. Where you get a journal and every day you add a room to a mega dungeon, and it like for a few weeks in January, it was like the thing everyone was talking about. I want to know, like, how far did you get? Did you have aspirations when this thing kind of took off that maybe you would collect and publish these? Was it only on the hobby D&D side? Like, tell me about your experience from Dungeon 23.
This was like almost like a classic old school G+ era OSR moment for me, right? Which was that I didn't have, like I would say with Mothership, like long-term financial aspirations sort of built around it. It was purely like a thing going like, hey, like if you wanted to write a mega dungeon, you could just start by writing a room a day, right? And a lot of those rooms could just say empty room, and that would also be fine. And then tweeting that and then being like, let's go with this. Let's write this up, right? So that people know this is a thing. And the OSR, a lot of people really took to it, right? I think I got about 6 or 7 months in. And then there were a lot of like, I got to the point where we were like having to ship Mothership and stuff. And I was going back and like redrawing 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And I was like, okay, cool. I've made it as far as I've made it. The goal is not for me to like burn myself out like finishing this, but it was really fun. And like, I like those really minimal keys where it's like 3 skeletons or whatever.
There are people who are like doing like full illustrations, like fully written rooms. Yeah.
People just need permission sometimes. Yeah. Like to sort of go wild. And I think that's what was such a hit about that was like, and then the group thing, like being part of a bunch of people who were doing something, right? Like anybody can go run a marathon by themselves now. Like nobody's going to stop you from running a marathon, but like, you want to be part of the community. You want to be doing it. And in some ways, you want to be given access into the community. And this was another way to do that, is by saying, like, I'm contributing. I'm part of this world, right?
Yeah, I think Ico even really started he started an itch jam for it. I'm assuming they finished it up. But yeah, my experience was, man, I was excited. I'm like, I'm going to do, have you seen Jungle Cruise, the Disney movie?
Sure, yeah.
I'm like, I'm going to do an Amazon River Pirate Borg dungeon crawl.
Great.
And I like plotted it all out. And I think I got like 3 weeks in, and I spent so much time thinking about that instead and wanting to like edit what I'd already made. And I had all these other things. I was just like, as a full-time designer, it was taking too much of my creative juice. So I was like, okay, I'm just going back to working on my other thing, but man, what a cool, like some of the projects that I saw are just really, really, really incredible.
Even one of my favorite creators, Quadra, who's a Mothership creator that did Warp Beyond Recognition and Hundreds, is still working on theirs because they plan to release it later. Yeah. And so they're like, I'm going to work on it at the rate that I can work on it. He's like a monthly calendar where the days are squares, and he draws and writes the key in each square. And it's very beautiful. I think the big thing I also want to get across with stuff like that is like, daily practice is huge. You can do huge things with small daily practice.
Sure.
And I think a lot of people have to make decisions about work-life balance or family, if this is the right place to put your creative energy. But like a room a day will get you a mega dungeon in a year. And if you don't think you can write a mega dungeon, you can,
That's definitely true. This is my daily practice this year. So, or this past month, how to draw comics and roll. I decided when I was 10, I just wanted to be able to draw like Todd McFarlane, and I decided at 41, I'm going to try. So yeah, daily practice, man.
I had that book since I was little. I got it at like a book stop and beat it up and like traced over it and all this. And eventually it crumbled, and then I bought a new one, but I think that book just gives me pure joy to see. It's a real fun book to just work through.
It's also cool, just like it's written by Stan Lee, or at least it says it is, and I just read it in his voice. It's just really cool.
Oh yeah, and it's like, what the fuck does Stan Lee know about drawing?
Nothing. But he even says it in the beginning. He's like, I don't know about this, but we figured it out, and I put my name on it. So
here's how we do it. Is it John Buscema?
John Buscema. Yeah. Very cool. A couple final questions. Can we expect to see Tuesday night booth at any conventions coming up?
Not really. We've been out of the booth game. We did it for a decade and we liked it and we were really good at it. But we don't have the bandwidth right now. So we're looking for solutions there. We like running a booth and we have a specific way we like running it. But I think in the next couple of years, it will be time to sort of re-enter that. I don't think it's necessary. If you're like a starting publisher, like, I don't know if I can afford to go to Gen Con. You don't have to by any means. But it is a good way to like get pumped up and to meet people and to see, like, you'll meet a fan. Like your game will be small and you'll meet somebody and be like, oh my God, this is my favorite game. Yeah. And you'll be like, this is why I do it. I've signed autographs, like pre-Mothership for 2 Rooms and a Boom. So it can be, I just went to Board Game Geek Con, BG Con this last weekend. Yeah. Cause I'm local. And Al and I did our annual like partner meeting. Like what do we got to do for next year? But like in terms of going and exhibiting, we're not sure what our strategy is going to be for that going forward, because it hasn't been an impediment to our to success.
Sure, yeah.
But I think when the kids are older, it's going to make more sense.
Oh, nice. I think for us, like I was very inspired by all your early writing about Mothership, and we were like, talking about Gen Con and Origins, like we got to get booths. And then to not see you there, I was like, oh man, I thought we were going to meet Sean and Alan. But for us, it's really our big inspiration for cons and booths has been Goodman Games, because that's a game company. Like, I don't think that Goodman, I know they're doing well, but like, I don't see them in game stores everywhere. Like they're in the good game stores, they're there. But when you go to any convention, their team, their people are there playing DCC every convention.
And Goodman Games has been around for forever. Pre-DCC, they were doing 4E and 3E adventures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Joe knows how to survive in this industry. And I was getting Origins where there was no DCC, and the next year there was. That was a big part of me getting into OSR, was like there's one table and then people are playing, they're selling the paperbacks. They run a good con, and it feels good to hang out with those guys. And like, they're running games and people are having a blast, that's the model for sure. We've really found that it's like, we didn't really realize it when I was making it, but Pirate has been a really good convention game because people know how to act like pirates. And so we've really just decided it's like, oh, you know what? It's not, we do have a booth to sell stuff, but it's not a sales funnel. It's a community builder, we're there to meet people and play our game, I'm excited for the future where I can come do that at a Mothership table. So yeah, absolutely. We had a big Mothership event planned before COVID hit. We were going to go to Gen Con, do a big thing. And like, we were going to run like 4 tables for like 12 hours a day or something like that. Like we had it worked out with the organizer, then COVID hit, and then it blew up during COVID. And we were like, okay, well, I guess we don't have to go back.
You're doing fine. Yeah.
But I think we will at some point. Yeah.
Hold fast, wretched sailor. We brace for the Broadside Barrage.
First system you ever played?
The Diablo 2 version of Dungeons and Dragons, which is AD&D 2E.
Oh, wow. That is an answer I have not yet heard. I love that. Most recent system that you've played?
Mothership, for sure. Mothership, yeah.
How about non-Mothership, most recent?
Non-Mothership, DCC.
RPG that you haven't played, but you would like to try?
Oh, man. I have a list of these. Pendragon, for sure. I would love to play Pendragon.
Favorite edition of D&D?
I think original Dungeons and Dragons scratches my itch just like on a lot of different reasons. But if I was going to run it tomorrow, I would just play whatever the newest version is, like 5e, 5.5.
Favorite movie in the Alien franchise?
It's probably Aliens. That's the one I would put on no questions asked, over and over and over again.
This can be a longer answer if you'd like, but thoughts on Romulus?
Yeah, I liked it. I think it's very Disneyified in that you can tell they're like trying to weave like a meta narrative together. But the things I liked are things I would have liked as a kid, which is like the face hugger swarm or the floating acid blood. They took like the elements and they used them in interesting ways. I would have loved to have seen a lot more of the stuff at the beginning with the like trying to get out of your contract and the stealing a ship and all that sort of stuff. I think there's a road to go down there that if they're courageous will really open the world up to a lot more stuff.
I mean, like, were you overwhelmed with like, this is a Mothership movie?
I definitely was like taking notes every now and then where I was going like, we should be getting in contact with Alamo Draft Houses and see if we could be running Mothership games and being like, come out, play Romulus, like with Mothership, you know. But yeah, there was tons of stuff where I was going like, that's a panic check. That guy just failed to, that's stress.
I just felt like the whole like, you got the corporate bullshit. You're locked into your contract. Now you have to go to this abandoned space station that was a science facility. I was like, this is literally a Mothership module, like more so than the other Alien movies, you know?
It felt a lot more influenced by its precursors than the others, which are like originators, you know?
Thoughts on the new Dune movies? Yeah,
I loved them. I really like Dune a lot. It took me a while to read it the first time, but once I read it, I was like, this is great. I like the first one. I saw the second one like 2 or 3 times in theaters. And I waited because my daughter was born around when the first one came out. So I didn't see it in theaters and I didn't rent it. I was like, they will re-release it. And I just sort of avoided everything about it. And then when the second one came out, they re-released it. And I went and saw it and I was like, this is amazing. I went and saw the second one. Just a sense of scale, like the giant scene with the sand harvester where they're shooting at the ornithopters or whatever, like felt huge and amazing. Ending's great. Can't wait for the third one. I'll watch the show for sure.
iPhone or Android?
I am a Mac user. I've got a watch, AirPods, laptop, iPad, the whole thing. They're testing me a little bit, but it's been what I've been using for a decade.
Okay, so I was very curious because I find a lot of my tech heavy friends often will go Android, but the ones that are on the more graphic side often will stay Mac. And I'm talking to you on a PC and I bought a new iPad yesterday. So it's kind of one of those vibes, you know?
No, some of it's like graphic designers want things that look pretty. Some of it was film when I was getting into film, like Final Cut was huge.
Sure. Yeah.
So that was sort of a thing. And then like they lock you into your ecosystem and you're in the ecosystem.
You, Sean McCoy, are a 7th level character in a fantasy RPG. What class would you be?
Thief, big time. Forever thief.
Add an entry to the what's in the cargo hold of the Ship of the Dead D100 table.
Oh, that's great. I want like a mummified hand.
There's been a lot of answers to this question, but literally the last person said a mummified hand as well. That was like a sentient.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So there's definitely going to be 2 mummified hands in this. Is there anything special about it?
Yeah, they're like lovers, right? They were like lovers' hands that were cut off.
Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. Favorite size die?
I like a D12 a lot.
I was wondering if you were going to say D100. I don't know if that doesn't really fit the size question, but
no, they're shitty dice. D100s, they're not like the technical polyhedrons or whatever, but like a D12, I've always been like, this feels good.
If you were given the rights to make a new TTRPG for any IP out there, and it was guaranteed to make a ton on Kickstarter, and you could clone you and a small team to work on it, what IP would you choose?
The Dark Tower by Stephen King.
RPG or fantasy setting you would most want to live in? Yeah,
Delta Green for sure.
I think I know the answer to this one, but Star Trek or Star Wars?
Star Trek, big time.
Oh, wow. No, the amount you talked about Star Wars on this
Star Wars
episode
makes so much sense, and it highlights so many issues in RPGs for some reason. But I was an original Star Trek fan. Big, like as a kid growing up, we had First Contact also like on VHS. So I watched that over and over again. I love the Lower Decks. I'm really sad it's ending. Star Trek brings something hopeful and amazing out in me. I like Star Wars a ton. But if I had to like put a bullet in the head of one, I would walk away with Star Trek a million times out of a million. That's so weird.
If you had to pick a favorite like captain or commander from a show, who would you pick?
I'm a Kirk guy, but like the movie Kirks. but Spock is my character.
Favorite fantasy movie, TV show, or book?
I just watched the Berserk anime for the first time. I've read it a ton, but I hadn't watched the anime. My brothers were like texting me about it. And it was so heart-wrenching that I really, and like heartbreaking, I really loved it. I think that's going to stick with me for a while.
Favorite libation or beverage during your RPG sessions?
I used to drink. I don't drink anymore. So I love like root beer. It's super like, that's my thing. Or like now I've just started making these like Brazilian lemonades where you're taking like condensed milk and like lemon and lime and that kind of stuff. Yeah,
I'm going to
super
check that out.
That would be a good pirate game drink. Yeah.
Video or computer game you've logged the most hours playing?
I've put a ton of hours into like Slay the Spire for sure. But I've also played Final Fantasy Tactics like 10 times.
Final question. Creator in the scene that you would love to see create a Mothership module?
You know, from a graphic design standpoint, Johan Noor or Jez Gordon are two huge graphic design idols. I would love to see them to do something in the Mothership space for sure. Just visually, that's like what stands out to me, you know?
It's interesting that you say that because not 2 hours ago did I tell Johan on his Blue Sky post about running Mothership, because he ran Mothership like yesterday or something.
Yeah,
I said,
me.
You can go see it. I literally said I would pay hard cash money for a Johan illustrated and designed Mothership module.
And he did a Mothership one shot for Dissident Whispers.
Ghost Ship or something?
Ghost Ship, I think. And it was beautiful.
That's a very, very appropriate for this show. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. But he's got his world, and he's killing it in that world. And
he does. Yes. He's actually the most, I think he's been on this show 3 times now. I mean, obviously I'm the Pirate Board guy, so it makes sense. But anyway.
Oh yeah. He's phenomenal. Big hero.
Sean, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. Where can our audience find more about you, Tuesday Night Games, and Mothership RPG?
So you can go to TuesdayNightGames.com. That's spelled with a K, K-N-I-G-H-T. Or you can go to SurviveSolveSave.com if you want to go to Mothership Month. And then you can find me on Blue Sky, Sean McCoy at whatever it is, bluesky.social or whatnot. But that's where I'm doing all my posting now. And you can go to FailureTolerated.com if you want to read my blog or sign up for my Win Conditions Substack.
You've been listening to the Ship of the Dead podcast. Email your questions, comments, and buried treasure tips to shipofthedead@limithron.com. You can support the program, join our Discord server, get early access to new episodes, and instantly download hundreds of battle maps, assets, and adventures at limithron.com/Patreon. Tiers start as low as $2 a release, and you only get charged when I make something new. Pirateborg, my rules-light, rum-infested hack of Morkborg, is available now at pirateborg.com and retail stores everywhere. Ship of the Dead is produced by Limithron LLC, our audio editor is Matt Kepler, and our music is by Alexander Miller. For more, head to limithron.com.